To the book of Ezekiel. And last week, we're kind of doing things in our study so far in groupings. We looked at Ezekiel 1 to 3 last week. Ezekiel 1 to 3 is a group. It kicks off the book, obviously, and it had to do with the call of Ezekiel. God calls Ezekiel, who was in exile in the land of Babylon, one of the first groups to go into exile. He's turning 30 years old, and here at the age of 30, just after his birthday, God calls him into service, and does so by giving Ezekiel this incredible vision of, you got to see God in all of his glory. And as we unpack that, one of the points that we recognize is that one day, just as Ezekiel got to see God in all of his glory, we'll get to see Christ face to face, and what a day that will be. One of the neat things about Ezekiel is that he doesn't just see God in all his glory once. In chapters 1 to 3, he saw God in his glory twice. And then throughout the book, he has a couple of encounters with God in much the same fashion. And that's true as well in chapters 8 to 11. The next slide, please, Scott. In chapters 8 to 11, which we're going to be going over this morning, we're going to read chapter 8 together in a minute. But the big thing that happens in chapters 8 to 11, Ezekiel is taken by God in a vision from where his home in Babylon. He's actually had a meeting. He was meeting with some of the elders of Israel. They were at his home waiting for a word from the Lord. And as they sit there with Ezekiel has this vision where God transports him to Jerusalem and gives them this tour. And the net effect of this tour that Ezekiel has by means of this vision is that the glory of the Lord departs from the temple and then the city, and then it ultimately settles on a mountain to the east of the city. And we need to ask a big question: why did God leave? That's the effect. God leaves the temple, leaves the city, and what is the significance of that, and why did God do that? And that's what we're going to be looking at this morning. But before we read chapter 8, I just want to give you, on the next slide, 2 slides, a brief outline of chapters 8 to 11. If you didn't get a chance to read it this week, check it out this afternoon maybe. Chapter 8, God takes Ezekiel on a tour of the temple. That's where chapter 8 begins. In effect, God shows Ezekiel why he's so upset. And God takes him on this tour. Look at this, look at this, look at this. And one of the things you see, if you're able to see on the right, there's an image of the god Ashtoreth. This was an image that Manasseh, years before, Josiah tore this image down. After Josiah was the last righteous king of Israel. Then after him, someone reset it up again. But this was one of the images that was placed in the temple of God. And God calls it the idol of jealousy. And we're reminded that God is a jealous God. He doesn't tolerate any competition. They put this in his temple. You want to know why was God upset? Why was God angry? This is one of the reasons why God was angry. And he shows Ezekiel, and then he tells Ezekiel, tell the people everything you see in this vision, so that they understand where I'm coming from and why things are happening as they're happening. Chapter 9, the inhabitants of Jerusalem, because of their sins, as outlaid in chapter 8, are judged, but not before those who love the Lord are marked for deliverance. And I'm going to show you that verse in our message today. The next chapter, chapter 10, as we look at the outline, the cherubim that Ezekiel saw in chapters 1 to 3, they weren't identified, those beings in chapters 1 to 3, they weren't called cherubim in chapter 1 to 3. They are called that now in chapter 10, so we understand exactly who they are. The cherubim that Ezekiel saw in chapters 1 to 3, they move from the inner, there's a progress of God departing. So Ezekiel sees the glory of the Lord, but in the inner room of the temple, there was the ark of the Lord, and that's where the glory of the Lord resided as a symbol of his power and his presence with the people. And so the glory of the Lord moves from the inner room to the threshold of the temple, and then by progress to the east gate of the temple, and then in chapter 11, where the final act is, the glory and presence of God departs the city and resides over the mountain east of the city. And so that's just a brief structural outline of what chapters 8 to 11 is all about. But let's get a taste, if you haven't already, by looking at chapter 8 together. Read it. We're going to read it. And then I've got a few principles that I want to share with you from this passage. In the 6th year, chapter 8 of Ezekiel, In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in the house of the elders of Judah. Now that kind of gives you, as I mentioned last week, Ezekiel is laid out in a chronological fashion. And Ezekiel has just finished following through on what God told him to do in chapter 4 and 5. Ezekiel, for 430 days, had to lay out in the street before a little Lego build-up, not Lego really, but a mock-up of Jerusalem, and act out a siege of the city of Jerusalem. He did that for 430 days, and he had to eat in front of the people a starvation ration. If you go to the grocery store, those of you who like fancy bread, you can buy what's called Ezekiel bread. And it comes directly from chapter 4 of Ezekiel, the exact ingredients, but they don't cook it the same way in the grocery store. Ezekiel had to cook it over cow manure. You'd be horrified if you had to buy bread that was cooked that way. But that's what God had Ezekiel do for 430 days. So Ezekiel follows God, obeys him, an object lesson to get people's attention so he can share the message. And then after that, so right as soon as he's done that job, in the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day, while I was sitting in the house and the elders of Judah were sitting before me, the hand of the sovereign Lord came upon me there, and I looked, and I saw a figure like that of a man, and from what appeared to be his waist down, he was like fire. And from there up, his appearance was as bright as glowing metal. He stretched out what looked like a hand, and he took me by the hair of my head. And then the Spirit lifted me up between heaven and earth, and in visions of God, so this is a vision that he has, in visions of God, he took me to Jerusalem, to the entrance, to the north gate of the inner court, where the idol that provokes to jealousy stood. That's the Ashtoreth idol that you saw in the picture a moment ago. And there before me, verse 4, was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision that I'd seen in the plain. And then he said to me, Son of man, look towards the north. And so I looked, and in the entrance north of the gate of the altar, I saw this idol of jealousy. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? The utterly detestable things the house of Israel is doing here. This is a neat verse. Things that will drive me far from my sanctuary. But you will see things that are even more detestable. And so he brought me to the entrance of the court, and I looked, and I saw a hole in the wall. And he said to me, Son of man, now dig into the wall. And so I dug into the wall, and I saw a doorway there. And he said to me, Go in and see the wicked and detestable things that they're doing there. And so I went in, and I looked, and I saw portrayed all over the walls of the temple, all kinds of crawling things and detestable animals and all the idols of the house of Israel. In front of them stood 70 elders of the house of Israel. The 70 elders were supposed to be representative of all the people. Remember God told Moses, you can't do the job alone, select 70 people. And so there's a connection with the number 70. It's representative of all the people. Pretty much everyone had abandoned God, but not everyone, no. And in front of the 70 elders of the house of Israel, and Janiah son of Shaphan was standing amongst them, and each had a censer in his hand, and a fragrant cloud of incense was rising. And he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the darkness, each at the shrine of his own idol? They say, the Lord doesn't see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. And again he said, you will see them doing things that are even more detestable. And then he brought me to the entrance to the north gate of the house of the Lord, and I saw women sitting there, mourning for Tammuz. Tammuz was a Sumerian god who was believed to be the god of the underworld. And in the fall, when all the vegetation died, they thought that Tammuz was dying. And then they thought in the spring, when the life came back to the plants, that Tammuz was rising from the dead. And so he was a fertility god. And so this one taking Ezekiel around says, this is what the people are doing. They're worshiping a fertility god. And they're weeping over his supposed death. And he said, do you see this, son of man? You will see things that are even more detestable than this. And then he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and there at the entrance to the temple, between the portico and the altar, there was about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, and they were bowing down to the sun in the east. So sun worship. The worshiping of the sun in the temple of God with their backs to the temple which was to be a house of prayer for all nations. Instead, they were using the courtyard to pray the opposite direction towards the sun. And he said to me, "Have you seen this, Son of Man? Is it a trivial matter for the house of Judah to do the detestable things that they're doing here? Must they also fill the land with violence and continually provoke me to anger? Look at them, putting the branch to their nose." We were talking about that at the table around supper, and we're not sure what that verse is about. The children thought maybe they were smoking up something, but who knows what they were doing, but they were something that God wasn't happy with. "Therefore I will deal with them in anger. I will not look on them with pity or spare them, although they shout in my ears. I will not listen to them." So Ezekiel gets a tour of the temple by means of this vision, and basically the one that God sent to give him a tour says, look at all the things. You want to know why God is angry? Here's the reasons why God is angry with his people. And in addition to that, they filled the streets of Jerusalem with injustice and the blood of other people in their murderous ways. And they haven't just did it for a day. It's actually, you know why Ezekiel had to stay out 430 days in the street? Because that's how long they'd been in the land. And for 430 years that they'd been in the land that God promised to them, they hadn't followed God in those 430 years. Sporadically, there was people that called them to righteousness, and they followed for a while. But the course of their entire existence in the land was actually one of rebellion against God. And that's why God had Ezekiel live out that symbol. But there's a few principles I want to share. The next slide, please, Scott. Oh, you're there. Ezekiel, he's ahead of me, meaning I need to go faster. Ezekiel chapter 8, verse 4. Have a look at verse 4. It says, "And there before me was the glory of the God of Israel, as in the vision I had seen on the plain." And so Ezekiel, he sees the presence of the Lord, the glory of God, just as he'd seen in chapters 1 to 3. And when it says that, the effect of that is it means God was there. That's what it means. The glory of the Lord was there. It means God was there. And when we think about the history of the Israelites, when they came out of Egypt, God led them by a pillar of fire and a cloud. When they walked through the wilderness, after God had them, remember he had to construct the ark and then construct the temple, the tabernacle, the tent of meeting. It was situated right in the very center of the Israelites, with all of their tribes arranged on the outside of it. God in the midst of his people. Then there's when they went to Mount Sinai, and the mountain was ablaze. God there with his people. Solomon builds a temple, the temple that David wanted to build, but God said, you can't because you've been a man of blood your entire life, because he fought lots of wars. Solomon gets to build a temple, and on its opening day, what happens? The glory of the Lord fills the temple, and God says, this is to be a house of prayer for all nations, the most important building on earth as a center of worship for God. God with them. And so when it says the glory of the Lord was there, it means that God was there. I find it also fascinating when we think about one of the names of Jesus. What is his name? Emmanuel. God with us. And what is the promise of the scriptures? The promise Jesus made to us, I will never leave you, I'll never forsake you, I will be with you to the very end of the age. And that's our great comfort as believers. God is with us. As God was with the Israelites during those periods of time, we think about the permanent indwelling of the Holy Spirit that we receive when we're born again. The Bible uses that phrase in John chapter 3. Jesus said, if you want to get into heaven, you must be born again. And that's the action of when the Holy Spirit comes into our lives, and we're indwelt, born of the Spirit, born of Christ, by our faith in Jesus, by our repentance. And then God stays with us our entire life. The second point that I have that really is the focal point of this vision that Ezekiel receives, chapter 8 to chapter 11 in its entirety, is God is no longer with them. That's the awful significance. What does it mean when you see the glory of the Lord first in the inner sanctuary where the ark is, and then you see the glory of the Lord at the threshold of the temple, then you see the glory of the Lord move to the east gate, and then you see the cherubim who are the attendants of God and who are the throne bearers of God they proceed and they lift up their wings and out they go. God leaves the building and settles above the mountain, it says, east of the city of Jerusalem. What does that mean? Well, it means you're in big trouble, first of all. If God leaves you as he left them, it means that they're no longer under his protection. They're no longer under his care. They have rejected him, and they've done it for 430 years, and God says, you're on your own right now. It's time for judgment. You are on your own. And so the glory of the Lord departs. Now, the other neat thing is it wasn't immediate. It was a long time coming, and also there's this progress from the inner sanctuary to the threshold to the gate, and then, even then, the mountain just a little bit east of the city. But why did God leave? That's the good question. Well, God, in chapter 8, verse 17, we already read, you have provoked me to anger. And you've done it over and over and over again. God is greatly displeased with them. In fact, not only was God displeased with them, the people had said, God, we just don't want you anymore. That's what they in effect said. Look at chapter 8, verse 6. They said, Son of man, do you see what they're doing? But you will, these things they will drive me from my sanctuary. You know, when they put all those idols up in God's temple, basically, and then when they said God doesn't see us, you know, you'll read later on in the visions and through chapter 9 to 11, the attitude was, what do we need God for? We've got all these other things that we worship and pray to. We're looking to them now instead. And so this obviously angered and upset God. And so when God leaves, it's part of their judgment against him. This handing over of God, of the Israelites, he handed them over to their enemies. No longer having God's protection, themselves becoming objects of wrath. It reminds me of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 31, wherein it says, it is a dreadful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. God leaves the building. They are under his, it's a sign of being under his judgment. It also reminds me of Romans chapter 8, verse 31, wherein it says, if God is for us, who can be against us? That's the positive side, isn't it? If God is for us, who can be against us? But then you turn it on its head, which is what this passage does. If God is against you, what hope is there for you then? You're doomed. And that's the message that God says, this is what is the consequence of all those things that you did in chapter 8, where God lays it out. You know, there's an interesting parallel. This is not the first time. Not yet. This is not the first time. Some of you that know your Old Testament and you know the account of 1 Samuel 4, you remember that during the days of the Philistines, before David was king, Samuel was a prophet. The Israelites thought that the Ark of God was like a good luck charm. Just carry the Ark of God and we'll get whatever we want and we'll win whatever battle we enter into. Well, the Philistines, God had sent the Philistines against the Israelites to oppress them because they were doing the same stuff. And they said, you know what, we have this great idea. Let's go get the Ark of God, and we'll run into battle with it, and we'll have a big shout. We're going to kick their butts, and we'll go home happy. Well, they did that, and they lost badly. The Ark was captured and taken to the Philistine cities. When the news got back, there was Eli, the priest, who was a big, heavy guy that couldn't see anymore, sitting on the rock like 94 years old. He hears the news, the ark's been captured. Now, he also heard that his 2 sons had been killed. They were wicked, Phineas and some other guy. I forget what his name is right now. Hophni. It's not the news of the death of his sons that caused him to fall off the rock. It's when he hears the ark of God has been taken. He falls off and breaks his neck and dies. Then, I can't remember which one of the gentlemen it was, but then the news is taken to his daughter-in-law, who's in the midst of giving, she hears this news and goes into labor and gives birth, and as she's just in the process of giving birth, she dies. But before she dies, what does she name her child? She names him Ichabod. Not Ichabod Crane, but Ichabod, which means no glory. And then she says, name him Ichabod, for the glory of the Lord has departed. Meaning God's not with us right now. That's why they lost. And here's this picture. God leaves the building, and there's no more protection and no more care because they said, God, we don't want you, we don't want you, we don't want you, we want to do our own thing. And God says, okay, experience what it's like to live without me and my care and my protection then. And they became, for a time, the objects of his wrath because of what they'd done. And you and I, when we think about it, it's comforting to know that God has promised to never leave us or forsake us. There's a great comfort in that. For God to be with us is for his care and his protection and his love to be upon us. That's the benefit of having Christ as our Savior. And Jesus said, I will be with you to the very end of the age. But what a terrible thing for those that say, I don't need God or his care or his love or his protection, because it puts you in an incredibly dangerous, bad spot to be. And you really, when you think about it, you don't want to be there. Rather, you want to be reconciled to God. And that's the call of the Scriptures. Be reconciled to God. Point number 3, there's some thoughts about what does it mean for the glory of the Lord. It says in chapter 11, verse 22 at 23, it says, Then the cherubim with the wheels beside them spread their wings, and the glory of the God of Israel was above them, and the glory of the Lord went up from within the city, and it stopped above the mountain east of the city. And so you ask some questions. I know it's all on the screen, but you ask some questions. Well, what is the name of that mountain? Well, the name of that mountain is actually the Mount of Olives. And you think, well, is there any other touch points throughout the rest of Scriptures with this place? And there is, actually. It's kind of neat. One of the touch points is it's the same mountain from which Christ ascended, following his resurrection in 40 days of proving to his disciples in the world that he indeed had risen from the dead. And, you know, the disciples are there. Jesus ascends. And it says in chapter 1 of Acts, verse 10, 11, it says, the disciples were intently looking up into the sky as he was going, when suddenly 2 men dressed in white stood beside them, and they said, Men of Galilee, why do you stand there looking into the sky? This same Jesus who's been taken from you into heaven will come back in the same way you've seen him go to heaven. Well, that's kind of neat. There's a touch point with the glory of the Lord departs and is above this mountain east of the city. This mountain happens to be the Mount of Olives. It happens to be the very same mountain where Christ ascends into heaven. Is there any other Scriptures where there might be a point of contact? Well, there is. Zechariah chapter 14, 1-5, an Old Testament prophecy that is yet to be fulfilled concerning the last days. God's pictured in chapter 14 as coming to standing on the mountain on this particular mountain in defense of his people, and God coming in his glory. And it says, then the Lord will come. In the last verse of verse 5 of Zechariah 14, then the Lord my God will come, and all his holy ones with him. And so is this a significant place? Well, in the Scriptures, it seems to indicate that this is a significant. So when the glory of the Lord hovers over this mountain, it's a significant place. And then I've just showed you how the Bible connects together with this particular place. Point number 4. Look at chapter 9. Chapter 9 is a very interesting passage. Chapter 9, verse 4. You only can ever understand chapter 9 if you read chapter 8. Reading chapter 9 on itself is probably not going to help your theology. You can only really understand God's judgment when you frame it within the offenses that have been committed against him. And so that's why it's good to read things in context. In judgment, God calls these ones in his vision to judge the city. And Ezekiel sees pictured out in his vision the judgment of God being enacted upon the inhabitants of Jerusalem. But there's something quite fascinating that happens. Before the judgment happens, look in verse 3 and 4. Now the glory of the God of Israel went up from above the cherubim where it had been, and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then the Lord called to the man clothed in linen, who had a writing kit at his side, and he said to him, Go throughout the city of Jerusalem and put a mark on the foreheads of those who grieve and lament over all the detestable things that are done in it. I find this a really neat verse. You know, God has said judgment is coming, and it's going to happen. But first, I'm going to spare those that are grieved by this. I'm going to spare those who are my followers. That's incredible when you think about it. God is able to save the righteous. We know this, don't we? In fact, we know it from, where is the verse? Chapter 2, 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 9. The Lord knows how to rescue godly men from trials and to hold the unrighteous for the day of judgment while continuing their punishment. That's a neat verse. God knows how to rescue his people from trials while at the same time taking care of those who are in rebellion against him. That's what happens in this particular passage. God says, go put a mark on everyone who grieves and mourns over the detestable things that are being done. I am going to spare them. There's another point of contact, and it comes in Revelation chapter 7, and it concerns the future in the days leading up to the return of Christ. Listen to verses 1 to 3 of Revelation 7. After this, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, each holding back the 4 winds of the earth to prevent any wind from blowing upon the land or on the sea or on any tree. And then I saw another angel coming up from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he called out in a loud voice to the 4 angels who had been given power to harm the land and the sea. And he said this, do not harm the land or the sea or the trees until we put a seal on the foreheads of the servants of our God. There's God protecting his chosen ones in the last days as the judgments are being unfolded. And then there's God saying, you know what, those who are mine I will protect. What did God do before he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah? You know, he had this conversation with Abraham. Abraham says, God, will you destroy that place? Really? What if there's 50 people that are righteous? God says if there's 50, 40, 30, 20, all the way down to 10, God says, I will spare that place, the entire place, for the sake of 10 righteous people. And yet, there wasn't even 10 righteous people in the entire city. But what did God do? He took out Lot and his 2 daughters and his wife, and then we find out his wife looks back. His 2 daughters don't turn out to be that great. And so in the end, it's just Lot. And yet there's God who will spare the ones who are his. And it brings the question, and it also relates, what did God do? Remember the plagues that came upon Egypt? God says, if you want your firstborn son to live, put the blood of a lamb on the doorposts, and when the angel of death comes, I will pass over that house, and your child will be spared, your son will be spared. It's a picture of salvation, isn't it? Judgment being passed over. And here is this picture of God and his mercy saying, put a mark on the foreheads of those that belong to me. Which then draws the bigger question, is your name written in the book of life? Are you at peace with God? Have you been reconciled to him? There is salvation full and free for all who call upon the name of Christ. And there's a way to be right with God. Not on our own terms, but by the way that God has laid out in Scriptures, through faith in Jesus alone. And so when we see this picture, when God says, go and put a mark, it ought to raise the question, is my name written in the book of life? Will I be passed over when judgment comes? And that's the great joy of us who know the Lord. And that's why we have a message to take. We call people, warning them of the judgment to come, because it's a real thing, but also pointing them to the love of Christ who died on the cross for the forgiveness of sins, that people can be reconciled to God. And that really segues into my last point, is we see the incredible mercy of God. We've got God judging his people, and we understand why he judged them by reading the text. But we also have the mercy of God. Chapter 11, verse 19 and 20, he's speaking to the exiles. And this ties back into Jeremiah 24, where the exiles of the class of 597 were actually the good figs. They got a blessing when they got actually taken away in the first deportation. God says, this is what I do for them. I will give them an undivided heart, and I will put a new spirit in them. I will remove from their heart of stone, their heart of stone, and I will give them a heart of flesh. It talks about, God says, I'm going to change their hearts and turn their hearts to myself, and they will worship me, and I will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. We always have to get that big picture. We read about God judging his people for sin, We always have to hold it in balance that there's the incredible mercy of God, which he lavishes upon people when they humble themselves and when they seek his face. And he takes stony, hard-hearted, rebellious people, and he brings them into his kingdom by his grace and mercy and transforms their hearts and lives. He does it for all who seek him. Seek me and live is what the scripture says. And I hope you hear that call, that the call is there, that the mercy of God who welcomes with open arms those who humble themselves, and he changes them and transforms them and lavishes his mercy and forgiveness upon them. And so we've got this complete picture. The most significant event, and it's hard for us on this side of, we haven't had a temple on earth since AD 70 when the Romans destroyed it in fulfillment of the prophecies of Christ. But it was the most important building on earth. And Ezekiel has this message for the people: God has left the building. He's no longer with you. And when we think about that message, that should have shaken his hearers up. But you and I, when we look at it from our particular perspective, is we're comforted by the fact that Christ has said to us, I will never leave you or forsake you. I will be with you to the end of the age. There's also the challenge, if you haven't responded in faith and repentance, to get right with God, to make sure your name is written in the book of life. And then we know that people provoke God to anger, but at the same time, there is the mercy of God which is available to those who would seek him and who would humble themselves. And the God's provision of the cross and of Christ, who shed his blood once for all to cleanse the unrighteous from their sins. That's the mercy of God. Let's stand together as we sing our final song, There is Power in the Blood. And there's no audio to it, so I need your strong singing voices.